Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 162. Thank you for joining us. Today, Jordan returns to the Kolbecast along with my wife, Maggie, to discuss Latin. Classical programs are always talking about the importance of Latin in the curriculum, but today we get to delve a bit more into some of those benefits, along with valuable information about learning and teaching Latin. I'm not sure what could be more enjoyable than sitting down with Bonnie, Jordan, and my wife for this conversation, so I hope that you'll enjoy the show as well.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Steven, homeschooling father of 5 and director of development for Kolbe Academy.
And I'm Jordan. As a product of homeschooling, I'm proud to teach Greek and Latin for Kolbe online and serve as the alumni and public relations director.
I get to start this week off with a recording with some of my favorite people, Steven and Maggie Hayden and Jordan Almanzar. Hello, everyone. Good to see you.
Morning, Bonnie.
Good morning, Bonnie. It's nice to be here.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
Jordan, we had an interesting conversation at my house last night about the usage of a colloquialism common in my area of the country, and that would be y'all. I heard that you were using it y'alls, and I felt that I needed to address that with you because there's y'all and there's all y'all, but I haven't heard y'alls with the S on the end. Can you use that in context for me?
Yeah, I hope y'alls are having a good day today. I mean, English is the only Indo-European language that doesn't have that distinction between you and you all. But I didn't grow up I'm not from the South, and so I didn't grow up saying y'all ever. My mother did. She says y'all and those things, but so I kind of making fun of it. I use y'alls in class. So that's where they're getting it.
Love it. Love it. Well, I grew up saying y'all, but I quickly worked to get rid of that when I would visit my cousins in Chicago up north, to get rid of that. So I didn't have that accent that they would like to tease me about, but it's come back. It's back. My y'all is back to stay. I'm rarely an all y'all person. Every once in a while.
I think it's always you guys. I hear you guys up here, mm-hmm. So it's kind of funny. That's gonna get canceled one of these days, I think, because of the guys part of it. But,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think that's been my default as well. So now it's more y'all. We'll see what happens, where that goes. That leads us into a discussion that we started on our previous episode with Agustina Cavazotto talking about languages. We're continuing that conversation today, this time about Latin. Jordan, you and I talked about Latin way back in episode 7 a long time ago. It's way past time for more of a discussion on that, a revisit to that and expansion. So we've brought Maggie in to have that conversation with everybody. Let's catch up with Maggie a bit. How have you been, Maggie? It's been a little bit since you've been on the Kolbecast.
Yeah, hi. I've been doing well, working on a lot of curriculum things and excited about some of the new books and products that we're coming out with in the fall. And I finished teaching my first year of Latin with Kolbe this year, and that was a lot of fun. I just wrapped up. I had a Latin 3 section. So we had, finals a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to miss those kids. It was a lot of fun.
I heard you came in, took care of Jordan's class once or twice too, that my kids were in. They were happy to meet you and get to experience your class as well. So that worked out.
It was fun. It was really nice to get to meet some of the students that were in, different classes, and a couple of kids that I actually was, I subbed for this year told me that I'll have them next year, and siblings of some of those kids. So it's kind of nice to know a little bit more going in who the students are and talking to the kids. So it's always a lot of fun to share my love of Latin with them.
So where does that come from, your love of Latin?
Really from my father. He knew how to read Latin fluently, and he loved learning, reading different books in Latin. I think he learned it primarily to read St. Thomas, but he had an incredible wealth of Latin knowledge. And he also, because of that, knew all sorts of other languages. He was naturally good at languages, but because so many of them are based in Latin, he just picked them up quickly. And I remember one day working really hard. I met a priest who spoke Swahili, and learn the Our Father in Swahili. And I thought that I might be able to, speak to him in a language that he didn't know, because I knew it wasn't a language based in Latin. So I came running home and started to say it to him in Swahili, and he responded with some Swahili of his own. So I then realized that the benefits of Latin and languages went beyond just the Romance languages. It's just a habit of thinking, and he could retain things that he had learned, and he thought about it. And I remember I kept working at it, and one day it just sort of all clicked, and it was fun. I always wanted to be good at it, but it took a while. I wasn't a natural student. I had to work through several years of high school and then in college. And then when I started teaching, it really kind of took off. And my love was always there, but then my ability kind of caught up, and I was able to really go pretty deeply into Latin, and then from there into Greek.
Where did your father's interest in Latin come from?
We've always wondered that.
Yeah.
He and my grandfather was a farmer, he basically built farm equipment. And he was, I think, a second generation from Sweden, but his three sons all started out their education in a minor seminary and then went on to become philosophers. So they certainly, they were exposed to it in school, I think, in both their grade school experience and then further in college, and then in their studies past college. So,
okay. Jordan, I know it's come up a number of times on the Kolbecast, but for those just joining the conversation, would you remind us of your path to teaching Latin for Kolbe?
Yeah, I would have never expected it when I started learning the language, but I didn't have the opportunity until graduate school, actually. So I really felt like I was catching up to other students, and I realized I had a professor that I really admired who had studied in Germany, and he could do research in Greek, in Latin, German, French, like whatever he needed, really. And where I was doing my graduate studies, they offered these languages, including Syriac, which is a language I studied. It's basically Aramaic, but it's Aramaic written in cursive, and there are early translations of it. So at one point, I was taking the four languages at the same time. So I kind of prioritized those during my master's degree because I knew I wanted to do research in the languages. But your first time through and learning quickly the way that you do in a college course, you take Latin for 2 years and maybe a third year of a more advanced reading course. I don't think you really make it your own. At least I didn't. It wasn't like I wasn't that great at the languages. It wasn't until, like Maggie, getting the opportunity to teach where it really became fun. And so somewhat like her father, who wanted to read it for a specific author, it was kind of like I knew to read certain things, I wanted to read them in the languages that they were. And so I got to that point. But it was really back in 2014 when Kolbe needed a Latin teacher, and I raised my hand and said, I'll do it, and started teaching all levels of Latin all at once. And after a couple years of that, you kind of outgrow the textbooks even, and they become somewhat boring, and you want to supplement, and you start reading Latin on your own. And so I don't have a degree in classics. I think it's really rare that I've had so many chances to teach the languages. But I'm really, really grateful and look at it as it's just been a gift from God to be able to get better and better at the languages through teaching them.
Let's talk about the benefits of learning Latin. You've mentioned some of them already, primarily the thinking that has already been come up, the way of thinking and the ordering of your thoughts. So can we start there and maybe build upon that? Some of when you encounter people who are either skeptical or scared of taking on the study of Latin, where do you start with them?
I would say with starting students, encouraging them to get started with Latin, usually at the beginning, they're excited for about 3 weeks. But as it starts to get a little harder, you really do need to kind of give them the encouragement and the focus on the kinds of benefits they're going to get out of it. And I've found that you really need to make it fun and engaging. A lot of kids quit Latin early because seems like it's just all drilling and they don't see the point. So sharing their vision, why they're doing what they're doing, and I also just try to make it fun. That's one of the things I love about teaching is sharing with students and making it fun for them.
Yeah, I guess that incorporates maybe introducing some topics other than just killing galls at some point then, right? So
that's a reference to Henley. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, even I was yesterday thinking about it at Mass, and we use consubstantial with the Father, and then you're thinking consubstantial. What does that mean? You can put that together. So what is substance? All these like real philosophical ideas. And I'll tell you, I think for me, one of the hidden benefits of learning Latin is that I can now in English really distinguish between what is Latin and what is Germanic or what is Old English. And that's kind of an interesting thing because we can use some words interchangeably, like Holy Spirit and Holy Ghost. I'm sure there's some kind of, they say there's a distinction, maybe ghost is more like a person, yet it has connotations in English, but it's from German Geist. It goes back that branch, but we have both of them in English. And I heard Jorge Borges, the Argentine poet, talking about this recently. I mean, he was speaking in English and talking about he loves English because it's half Latin, half German, and it like opens up then all these possibilities to use those words. So I think that was a hidden benefit. And I'll tell you, the listeners may not realize Latin is interesting. It doesn't have, for example, definite articles. So you can't say the really in Latin. It has like ways of, I mean, there's like workarounds, especially in later Latin, but you have to infer, does this mean the Gaul or a Gaul, and those sort of things. That was maybe one of the most surprising things to me in learning Latin. I'd be curious to know what if Maggie can remember back to her student days, something like that, maybe that was surprising that the listeners might not know about Latin or might not expect.
Yeah, I do remember that same thing, dealing with the articles and being surprised that they were not there. The other thing that really surprised me was the use of pronouns and how different pronouns are used. I actually found it really helpful because we use pronouns in English all the time without really thinking about all the distinctions, but you have to make these distinctions between is it reflexive or personal, and then whether you're going to, you can't just automatically see a word and say, this is my, so it's going to be this form. You have to think, is it personal? Is it reflexive? Is this something that I can only, that there's limitations in the English where I will say of me, this is actually an of me as opposed to a my. And so you have to actually even infer from that, like, what is the, how should I use this? So that was a really interesting part. And the other one that was a little later was the use of when, because our word when in English is used for such a wide variety of things. And I love teaching that concept to my students and showing them that they naturally make distinctions. I tell them stories and they'll say, what question would you ask? And they say when, and it's like, but that when is not the same when as the when of, time. We use that word in different ways. And the Latin, it's the word cum, but there's cum and there's quom, and they've been kind of mixed over time. And so one of them has a kind of causal sense and the other or circumstantial sense, and the other has a time sense. And so that was a really fascinating thing to think about. This word that I used all the time in English, I had really no concept of the intentionality behind using that word. And now when I say when, I think about it, actually. I think, how am I using it here? And it really, that has been the kind of eye-opening thing, just seeing those differences between the two languages. And that was a really exciting thing for me.
It makes it so vivid, and some of that you can't translate it. It can't come across exactly because we don't have a way to do it. The way they do, certain things, I won't get into too many details about Latin, but the way, so some people wonder the value of learning Latin. Well, if we care about the authors all the way up until the late 1700s into the 1800s, when everything or much was still being written in Latin, do you want to be told what those guys said by somebody else, or do you want to meet them? And learning Latin is the ability to meet them and then actually appreciate them and the styles and the certain turns of phrase that they'll use and things that you could never translate. You could never see it in translation. So that's one of the huge rewards of learning Latin.
Yes, absolutely. When I was doing my finals this year with my students, one of them, we spent time in an oral final component of the course going through the words of consecration and looking at the intentionality of each verb in the Roman canon. And it was one of the most fun and illuminating experiences. And it was not at all like a test. We were both excited, noticing the verb tense choices and when there were participles and talking about why that might be. And that was just one of the most fun moments I've ever had in teaching, but also I think is what I want students to see. It's meeting the authors, thinking about what does this mean? Putting it into English, you lose something that when you see it in the Latin there, it's beautiful. It's exciting.
Do you find that students, do they have a hard time believing that they will eventually reach that point where they won't need to be translating word for word or even, sentence at a time to get the context?
Yeah, I think so. I think, sometimes it's hard in the moment, but one of the things I always love doing at the start of the year is giving them a challenge text somewhere in the early couple weeks. And they struggle with it. And they say, this is too hard and I can't figure out these words. And they're trying to break apart everything and analyze everything. And it's painstaking. And they say, it's the hardest hour of my life. And at the end of the year, I give them the same passage, but a little farther on, but the same author, same style. And I give it to them and they rushed through it in 10 minutes and had a perfect translation. And then I pulled up the passage from earlier in the year and said, look at this. Look at what you've learned. Because I want them to go on. I want them to think about, in the moment, this was hard, but they couldn't do this at the start of the year. And at the end of the year, it was easy.
Yeah, I remember when I showed it when I lived in Germany and I showed one of the textbooks to a Latin professor there, an American textbook, and he kind of laughed because it said, "You're about to begin your Latin journey," and he was like, "You Americans, everything's a journey, and you have to." But I do think in a way it has to be experienced like that with students because it's a long ride. You've got to go the 2 years to get through all the grammar. And when I was learning, I remembered I wanted to see the end of it. I just felt like I didn't really know English grammar that well. I didn't know parts of speech and everything. And so I'm thinking, when is this ever going to end? We just keep getting all these new things. And so those little successes that they get, like what Maggie's describing, if they get, it's a big success actually, but that gives them hope for this journey to keep going. And man, I've had students by the end of who will take it for 4 years of high school, and maybe they even had some before. They're as good as me. They're fantastic at Latin. I have a couple right now, just from this past year, that I would say they're probably they're where I'm at. We see the same things, and that's really fun when they get to that point. I mean, Latin is an equalizer, and so there's no, if somebody is is a little bit kind of full of themselves and they think I'm great at languages or whatever, Latin will level them at some point. It just happens. And so I always say, you'll never conquer Latin. You have to be conquered by it. It has to be that you become, and you learn to think and you conform to Latin, because you can't force it into what you're thinking. And so when we talk about the benefits of it, teaches you how to think and all of that's really what it is. You can be conformed to the modes of thinking of the great philosophers and historians and theologians, you can't help but think that way, as Maggie was describing with whenever she says when, and I do that with whenever I say that for like what's called an indirect statement. In English, we just say, I think that. We say the word that, which is indicating something over there, and then we just repeat what it is. Latin does it in a really beautiful way. And so those kind of things get stuck in your mind. And I think it makes you into a better writer, better reader, or everything. I mean, I could go on and on about the benefits, but students that keep taking it and go that far, to me, it does. I've always thought, why take the 2 years? You just, when you get done with the second year, you're to the point where now you can enjoy it. Now you can use it. And so any students or anyone who's thinking about jumping off the Latin bandwagon who's listening to this, I would say try that the third year with Maggie, and you will be hooked and you will have it forever after that.
That's absolutely true. If you do the 2 years and stop at that point, you don't have the you've done all the grammar, all the basic grammar, but you haven't really experienced the joy that it can bring you when you read the different authors. And it won't stay the same way, because many, and there are benefits to being able, like, you think now, oh, well, I did it, I checked off the box, I'm done. But if you're going to go on to college and you're going to, and you want to go to graduate school and you have to learn a second language, Latin is so many of the, the philosophy that you have to read and study is going to be in Latin, and you'll want to do it in the original language. You have to. And it's actually the basis of so many other languages. So though I've never had formal Spanish or French or any of the other languages other than Greek, it's the only other language that I've actually picked up a textbook and systematically gone through. I can read almost every other Romance language, and without too much difficulty. And even one time with one concept I was trying to understand in Latin, and it was really a difficult one. And I looked through all the grammar books, nothing was giving me an answer. So I went to the Greek, and I was looking for the answer there because I was thinking about the commonality, because a lot of the Greek was incorporated into the Latin in some way. Still couldn't find it. But then I found a book online in Romanian. And, the letters are kind of like Greek letters, but the words are much more, and sometimes like a Latin word. And I was able to actually decipher enough to find my answer. So I've never studied Romanian, and it was really painstaking, but I was able to figure out this one particular book addressed this particular issue, which was why the E is retained in your fourth principal part of fourth verb when you're going to the participle form. So it was a very specific thing I wanted to know, and I was able to find it. So that's just an example. So for those who are listening and thinking, well, yeah, I want to do languages, but I want to do something practical. Latin is very practical, for anyone. And then medical professions. I mean, there are so many other things. Think about all the careers you could go into. Many science fields have words that have Latin roots. And I see my own children, when they're learning their biology terms, have always gone back to their Latin and thought about the Latin in those terms.
For me, Latin, although just 2 years at college for Latin was all that I had. But for me, it was the best way that I learned English was through Latin, because I had grammar, Warner's and everything in my, in my public school experience. But to actually study it in Latin, I could clearly see what was being done with the words. Whereas in English, it just seems like a big hodgepodge when you're looking at things. But then I specifically remember studying for the GRE. Well, you might remember that too, Maggie. Every Saturday during my senior year or whatever, trying to do one of those practice tests. But Latin was the only thing that saved me on the vocabulary sort of section, because I could see all of those root words and say, okay, this is what this word has to, at least it's where it has to come from, whether it means that anymore in English or not. It has to come from this sort of thing because of the. So I'm only marginally proficient in English, I think, because of Latin.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've noticed that students who do Latin, at least when they have that grammar down, they are much better at their English, at their writing. They're actually better thinkers too, in general. I mean, often they're doing other subjects as well, but I've noticed just that habit of thought and approach to looking at something and breaking it down, problem solving. What do I know? It really helps with that. And, I think it's no accident. I was looking up what are the score differences? And right now, students who do Latin get about 100 points higher on national tests across the board in the reading, in the writing, and in the math sections that they have. That's the current averages. So that's why. It's that familiarity with vocabulary, that clarity of thought and writing, and that clarity of thought and thinking. It helps.
And that what's amazing about that is people might assume, that only the most talented kids or whatever can learn Latin, but that's really not the case. Reginald Foster, who some people may be familiar with, who was a papal Latinist in America, who's a great Latin teacher, died a few years ago. But I remember a video where he would say, any dog in Latin, any Roman dog could understand, come here, your dinner is ready. So come here, your dinner is ready. The dog is going to come. And he was using that to say that we can understand it. You definitely, and there was a movement against really learning Latin, I think, for a long time. And what they would denigrate it by saying, no matter how good you get at Latin, you'll never be even as good as Cicero's kitchen maid at speaking it or using Latin or whatever. And my thought is, who cares? Does it matter? Does it really matter? It does something for you personally. And so I think some of these students that are scoring high on these tests and things like that, a lot of them probably went through a battle that they will never forget and that they came out victorious through in learning Latin. And now they can do anything intellectually. They probably gave them this confidence and stuff they would have never, ever gotten before. So it's a real opportunity for that, to prove yourself to yourself.
And I know people say that there's value in learning any inflected language, but one of the things that always really appeals to me about Latin is kind of the not being used in casual conversation any longer aspect of it, because I see in English all the time where words just change, so it's hard to really have a philosophical discussion about the meaning of this word. You can to some extent, but like even the most, maybe this is just a corruption, but like the interchangeability today of well and good that, I was chided for all the time by my teachers growing up. It's like, no, well is an adverb and this is good is an adjective. And it's like, you can say that as much as you want now, but people will just flip them or use them as they want. But you're not going to do that with Latin. You can clearly say, well, that's the wrong word to use here. It's incorrect. You have to conform your mind to the subtleties of the meanings. And I think when I became a little familiar with Latin, it was one of the fun things for me to do when I could actually have fun with Latin was to try to translate from English to Latin, intentionally using words that said it meant the English word, but I knew it really wasn't the word that I should use. But which is a bad translation, of course. But the fact that there's that subtlety that even though this means they can be translated as the same word in English, it has a completely different connotation or different meaning. I think, Maggie, you were saying in your class about the word, is it to hold, to habere or something, to where have, but
oh yes, yeah. We had this fun thing because there's so many meanings of the word. Our word have or hold in English is very very loose, and you have different words in Latin. You have teneo, you have habeo, and you have the dative of possession, which is like saying instead of I have a horse, there is a horse for me. And I loved, teaching that by making the students give me the English precisely when they had something to do. So if one of the students would say, I have to go to basketball, I would say, no, which word are you using and how are you going to use it? And we talk about, there's basketball for me, or whatever it was. It was it's a really interesting thing. So I would, it's just another example of how English has had that kind of looseness, and those words have been corrupted. But the way they were using it when they would put it into Latin was like, one student, when he gave me his sentence, I said, "You're holding your house." That's a really odd thing to do, and it was just kind of a fun thing to kind of talk about those different meanings. And there is that precision there because it is a dead language.
Yeah, it is locked in. There's a super good quote, and I forget it exactly, but it's a quote about how if you speak a modern language, you can stand up in front of a crowd and talk for an hour and not really say anything. But with Latin, this is impossible. And I fully agree. There's debates like in philosophy and theology classes, especially at college. There'll be a few students who would just always challenging the professor or whatever. And I'm convinced that if classes were being taught in Latin, not that we'd ever go back to that, but just hypothetically, if they were being taught in Latin, those debates wouldn't be there because everyone would be moving the same. And so either if there was a debate that would come to a resolution that everyone would see clearly. One of the words Steven and I talked about one time, dubito, dubitare, the idea of like doubt, and we translate it as to doubt, but it really means to hesitate, which is it's in Latin, the context, you can tell what's better, but it's typically to hesitate, and it's hesitating before options or whatever, and then you just translate it as doubt. It makes you think just disbelief or whatever, or lack of belief. There are so many words like that if we were seeing the precision and looking them up in good dictionaries, Latin dictionaries, and seeing them the way they've been used over time, I think a lot of this ambiguity and debate and all of that everything would be much more precise, and we would know things and see them clearly.
I love that. And it was probably with the story of doubting Thomas, maybe that we were talking about that, where, because when you say doubting Thomas, you think he's in English, I immediately think that disbelief sort of thing, it's like shame on him for not believing the words of our Lord, and demanding these things. But if it's a hesitation, if it's like, wait a second here, he was here in the flesh, and this is, I haven't seen this. Well, maybe it's not unreasonable to hesitate before just believing, being told somebody was actually brought back from the dead in their body, and these things were happening. So without that sort of study of the Latin, or of looking at those distinctions, I wouldn't even think of it. It would just be, this word has this connotation to me, so I'm going to throw it out there. But it really allows you to look at what the thought is behind it, what's really going on when you've got that study of language. I love it.
Yeah, all the way, going almost full circle to what Bonnie started with the idea of y'alls. You still have it in like the King James with the thee and the thou. You have this distinction, but I always read the little book of Philemon, or Philemon, as you might know it as. But I always read that with students every year. There's at least one group that I read it with, because it's really important in that story to distinguish who is St. Paul writing to. So it's Paul and Timothy, and they name several individuals, and they say, unto the church that's in your house. And right there, when they say the church that's in your house, it switches to singular. So it's one of the three individuals he names. And then throughout the letter, it's singular, and then it switches to plural again at the end. So just that little seeing second person singular, second person plural, it makes a big difference. I can hesitate on I can dwell on that question immediately with students, and it jumps right out to them because now they're looking for it. The verbs are singular, the pronouns are singular, and St. Paul is writing, even though he names 3 individuals and a church, he starts writing to one of them. And that becomes makes even just that brings you a lot closer to the meaning behind the letter, just seeing that. Whereas in a modern English translation, you wouldn't be able to see that. Reading the Bible in Latin it takes shots from both sides of the things, because experts in New Testament stuff, they're like, yeah, but Latin, it's a translation, why don't you read it in Greek? And then there's other people who are like, yeah, but it's just Latin, and we have modern translations, why go through all the work? But I think reading the Bible in Latin is one of my favorite things. In fact, in some ways I prefer it over Greek even. Not that I personally prefer it because it's easier for me. I know much more Latin vocabulary, and I don't have to look things up. I can just enjoy reading it. So I think that's, even if that isn't, there was a point where I said that in my own Latin journey, if all I ever do with Latin is I can read the Bible in Latin, it would have all been worth it. And I think anybody should make that as their goal and read the Latin Bible.
Right. Yeah. And there is actually a really easy way to do that. And I think that too. And I've encouraged my students in that this last year, and in my class. And then I've done this in past years as well in teaching students, but I've given them a challenge to read the Psalms. We start with Psalms every day for a set period of time. And this last year in my class, I challenged them for 30 days, but I challenged my son to read 1 Psalm a day until he completed all 150. And that was and it was simply read. We had the process was he would read it in the Vulgate in Latin, and then he'd read it in English in the Douay Rheims, so it should be close, to that. And then he'd just repeat that every single day. And all the students I've had who've done that talked about how at first it was just kind of a frustrating exercise. I'm reading those words, but I'm not really understanding. Why am I doing this? I could just read it in English. But if they stick with it, after a while, they start just picking it up and say, oh yeah, I knew generally what was said. So they're actually starting to internalize the Latin and not even have to translate it and just know what it means. So it really isn't, if anyone who has even the first 2 years of Latin down, they do that, they'll actually get better. And it's just a 10-minute commitment every evening.
Yeah. Wow.
Most of the Latin that I would read or could kind of read after my classes were the ecclesiastical Latin, the church Latin, so I could read the canons and things like that. But I assume that one of the advantages for the most part in Latin as well is that you're not getting these turns of phrase. I think, Jordan, again, we've talked about this, like raining cats and dogs, or whatever. So I'm sure there are things like that come up in the text, but that would just seem so different to me than like trying to learn modern French, where you have to figure out, well, how do French people say this thing? What idiom it is that they use? Where in Latin, you're looking more, I guess this is the static sort of nature of Latin, but I would assume that it's not a focus on those things in any of the Latin courses. Except like Martin of Denmark, was something about, what is it? The circle on the sign indicates the wine in the wine cellar or something like that. Is that
always right? Yeah. Yes. Yes. And I actually brought that up with my students this year, and they said, "What? That's what every circle means in geometry." So I don't think it must be the same thing.
Geometry would be my favorite course.
We've talked about this too, about how learning Latin is like learning to play the piano. The rudiments of that, the foundational things about playing the piano and going up.
Yeah, it's like it gives you everything. You're not limited. It's not in just one certain key, like that sort of thing. And it's all you get the theory behind music and everything. If you become really good at that instrument, then it's very easy, I think, to transfer that over to guitar, to trumpet, to whatever. And I met a man in Germany. I probably talked about him before. A teacher there, a language teacher, and he was an older guy, knew over 20 languages. He didn't know how many languages he knew off the top of his head. And he would sit and read in everything. He spoke English perfectly. He was German, of course, and but he would have a stack of books, and they'd be in French and Portuguese and Italian, and he knew languages outside of that group even. So he could read in Arabic, he could read in Hebrew, and I loved talking to him. And he attributed it all to having a Latin background. He went to a Latin school growing up, and he attributed all of his language ability to that. And so, as Maggie was mentioning earlier, not studying other languages formally, but being able to make your way through them, I think that's kind of that's what he did. I asked him if he took classes, and he said no. After learning Latin like that, he was able to get the languages. And that's probably the same thing with instruments. You could probably, if you really wanted to learn a new instrument, you'd be new skills or whatever. But you would know the theory, you would know all of that ahead of time, and that would be a huge advantage than starting cold with the clarinet or starting cold with Italian. You may not know the whole philosophy behind all of that. So I definitely think that's a good analogy.
Maggie, I know one of the things you've mentioned, or you've said multiple times, I'm not sure if you still hold this to be true, but that there are no exceptions in Latin is what you've said to me before.
Yes, I do believe there are no exceptions in Latin. I still believe that. There are things that you can't explain as easily as other things, but you can always come to there's always something. Everything that I have ever thought, well, maybe this is an exception, it wasn't. There is a reason for it. And that's partly because one of the things I do when I'm teaching Latin is I focus on how vowels and consonants join together in different ways. And if you have that principle, you can look at any new word that you've never seen before and break it apart and figure out what it is and what it comes from. So the few times where I've thought, this is an exception, it turned out there was a little bit more to it that I hadn't, discovered yet. And a lot of those come from when you're seeing the earlier Etruscan languages, and they don't have all those vowels. So you realize which vowels have it kind of developed, had a significance early and which ones didn't. And so we always joke about the letter E by itself being a real second-class citizen, sort of the natural slave of the Romans. It did the job that no one else would do and would go away whenever anything else came along that was better. And we've used that though to help decode new words, things that you see that you don't know what this is. Is this a noun? Is it a verb? Is it, how is it being used? You can apply your rules and you can usually figure it out. And then you can go look in a dictionary and see if you can find the root word. So yeah, I've not yet seen an exception.
That would really make a difference for me, because like when I need to understand like the whole of something when I'm doing it. So the more exceptions you throw out, the more I think there's no logic to it. And then it's just memorizing all sorts of random trivia and that makes it super hard for me then. But the idea that no, there's reasoning behind it and you can reason to it is like, oh, good. I can do this now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There is trust involved. And I think, Maggie, I think that's great. I haven't thought of that before, but I would totally agree thinking of it in these terms. And if you have a teacher, if your guide is telling you this, that if you're the student, there's always this trust thing that has to go on. If you believe your teacher that there are no exceptions, and you believe your teacher that you should memorize these things, it will become important later on and all of that. You start to trust the language, I think, and that's a big part of it's valuable. So Steven, like knowing that there's reason behind all of it, and maybe you're the one who hasn't arrived there yet, but it's you, it's not the language's problem or fault.
You could see that appealing to folks who are mathematically inclined, who appreciate that quality about mathematics, also appreciating that about Latin.
Yeah, I remember a story. One of my students, actually, they were learning French, and there were all these exceptions. I wasn't the French teacher, by the way, but they were learning French, and there were all these exceptions with verbs that they had to learn that had ease, and it was just, this is an exception, memorize it. And that student was extremely good at Latin, and she came to me and she said, this has got to be, since French comes from Latin, it's got to be their application of those rules with E. And she worked it out and came up with the system so that even that verb in French had no exceptions.
Oh.
And it just was, I mean, that would never have happened had that student not had 6 years of Latin and was able to just kind of think through all of this and apply the rules and knew all the little nuances. But it made French a lot easier, just to know those same, apply those same rules, assume since they have a common origin that was a leftover. And it was.
I love these stories you've been telling about your classes along the way. Do you have others that come to mind, fun stories from class you want to tell us?
Well, I have one of the really fun things we did this year, because when you get to a higher level of Latin, you want to actively engage the students in not just the reading and their grammar review, but in composing and creating their own thoughts in Latin. So we've done some fun things. Like this year we did a kind of murder mystery where everybody played a role. And they had their lines to say and things to figure out and certain things they had to add to find out who had committed the murder. And nobody knew anybody else's part. So we had a lot of fun with that. And then we also played games where I would just give them words and they would have to respond with something. And it was like a kind of a scavenger hunt. So could tell somebody to go outside and get leaves in Latin. And the first person who would figure it out would just kind of click, and you'd all of a sudden see the students' light bulb goes on and they tear off the screen and they'd come back in and with whatever they thought it was. And it was really fun. But doing those kinds of things and just composing in Latin, those were some of the highlight moments, because I could just see the students just totally involved in it. Like everybody was having fun. They saw it as just, the most fun thing we could be doing in class. And I just loved watching that as they're figuring it out. And you see their little, their faces would light up and somebody would dart off the screen, they'd come back, and sometimes someone would come back with the wrong thing. And other kids would go, no.
Oh, that's great.
Those are the really fun moments.
Yeah. What about you, Jordan? I hear a lot of laughter happening while my kids are in your class. Do you have any particular stories you want to tell us?
We had a lot of fun in the lower levels of Latin are just full of energy and fun, and I think they're not what most students are expecting coming in. But for me this year, I think probably the most memorable thing that happened in my Latin 4 class. So these are students who had, they're beyond AP Latin, really. They're taking it for college credit through Magdalene, where I'm also a professor. They've worked it out where they get some college credit if they come to Magdalene. I don't know all the details, don't really care that much, but this is one of the things we did in the course of reading classical authors was we translated the martyrdom of Felicity and Perpetua and made a new translation, and it was amazing. It was kind of life-changing in a way, I think, for the students too. Some of what we were seeing in there was totally unexpected, and so to read it, this person, a North African saint who was executed for not sacrificing to the pagan gods, and just the strength that she had to stand up to her father. And it's very graphic, very bloody. I mean, it was an amazing story. So translating that with the idea that this has a destination, actually. And so what I'd like to do is do something similar with these advanced classes over the years, and kind of put together a Kolbe translation of some of these early testimonies of martyrs. And man, it was the best thing that we've read together. And I read it out loud to my daughters as we were translating each week. I'd read them the next part, and then one day we just sat down. I read the whole story to them. And this year they both were confirmed, and they chose as their confirmation saints Perpetua and Felicity after hearing that, which I thought was really, really awesome. And somebody, their sponsor, gave them these little medals that have Perpetua and Felicity side by side. So anyway, that was one of the most memorable, I think, journeys I've taken with students ever, was doing that specific translation. It was awesome.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and when you do that and you spend time with it every week, and it becomes a part of you. So those stories are ingrained in a way that's just different because you've seen all the little subtleties of the account as well. So you remember going through that, and then it's really there. It's really a part of you.
And you're right about that. And it gives you this opportunity that we did as a class. Like eventually, like I'll have to be the main editor and make all the final decisions. But things would come up, like there's a part where she has a vision, and she sees Jesus, and he speaks to her in Greek. He calls her teknon, child, in Greek. And so we're deciding, do we leave it in Greek because the account is written in Latin? Do we want to leave that specific word in Greek because it gives the feeling of what we saw? Or do we translate it and put a footnote there? Like all these, that's just one of many things like that every week that the students got really good at knowing the issues that would come up. Because I was kind of telling them, as a publication, how do we want to do this? What do we footnote and what do we leave as is? And so that was, I think, beyond that. They were so good at Latin. The Latin wasn't really the challenge. It was more, how do we make this into something for the future? And I wanted it to be an experience like that for them. And I hope they felt it as much as I did. I think they did from talking with them. But that's why I wanted an opportunity using Latin beyond Latin, I think.
Boy, again, with the benefits of that, where you're thinking about the intentionality of the words being used and just trying to keep that up. And it was making me think of just one of the past Sundays, St. Paul saying, nobody can say Jesus is Lord except through the Spirit. So I guess it must have been a Pentecost Sunday. And at first you think, well, Jesus is Lord. Well, yeah, that's something. But I mean, so in the Old Testament or whatever, the connotations of the Jews using that word, the Lord, which is the name of God. So it's saying more than just like he rules my life. But no, you can't say Jesus is God, and without the Holy Spirit. And so that's all lost in English, but it's still, I think when you've developed the habit of learning Latin, you're thinking of what's going on there, what word must be, because at first when you just read that sentence, to me at least, it's like I've heard it a lot, so maybe I don't think about it. But when I think about it, it's like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. But then if you think about what's actually being said, then it's like, okay, that's profound then, that it's not just a throwaway line or something like that. So I think that habit that's developed is just wonderful.
Yeah, and I like that intentionality and the attentiveness too. That's what we're trying to, those are among the things I'm trying to cultivate.
Yes, yeah. And I do also have to say that it is amazing too when we think about the intentionality, but there's also intentionality in different authors. And so when you're in the upper levels of Latin, like Latin 3 and 4, you'll be able to see that, which is also a beautiful thing. Like comparing, going through authors. I've had students doing, Caesar, of course, Cicero. In his Latin is much more sophisticated and beautiful. We've done a little bit of Ovid. Then we've done some of the later, church authors. So we did Jerome, so they could appreciate the change to the more of the kind of the Greek forms words, and some Augustine, and a little bit of Athanasius and Saint Anselm, or not Anselm, Ambrose, Saint Ambrose. And we were doing all of those, and then I was really pleased because they all have little minor differences in their style of writing. And at the end of the year, I put up passages from every author, and I had them go through without identifying them. Who wrote this? Who wrote this passage? What is unique to their style of writing? What forms do they use? And even that in itself is just a preparation for being exposed to all sorts of other Latin later. If these authors do it different ways, they'll put verbs in these places, they'll have a lot of participial phrases, they like using cum clauses in this way, they like using the word quia to emphasize factual things. When they see that, it was a really exciting moment to watch the students looking through the little passages I put up and saying, oh, that has these phrases, so it must be this author. Oh, wait, it could also be this one. And then they would compare, and they got it all right through their class effort of working through that. And that's something to prepare them for being exposed to later things like the Perpetua and Felicity, the Passion account there, because that's a different style of Latin. And you want students not to be afraid when they see that, to say, it's going to be hard for the first couple lines, but it's going to get faster and better as we learn the vocabulary, we learn the style, we learn how this author, writes, and then it's going to get so much faster. And so it just that ability to both have that early exposure and then the later just working through something consistently are both really good things. And I think it kind of capstones in that fourth year of Latin when you can go through a single author and spend a lot of time on it and just see it's exciting. It's a really exciting thing to see how much faster and better you get. So I would say to students who've done just a couple of years, if you pick up something, you start reading it and it's hard, don't just say after a first hour, oh, this is too much for me. You got to keep working through it because you'll pick up the style, and it'll get faster and better.
I was going to ask if you had some words of encouragement for students who have just started, maybe done 1 year of Latin, and however that went for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's great. Okay.
Yeah.
I think, Maggie, some of the advice you seem to give to your students as well as they're starting is do it consistently every day. So just like playing a musical instrument, as we talked about earlier, but even if you don't have to spend an hour and a half necessarily doing it, but just sit down and make sure you're doing it so that you've got that daily experience of.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's one of the things I've always said to students starting out with Latin is if you hold off and you do all your Latin on one day of the week, you're going to lose the benefit. So even in my homework assignments, it was never do this assignment. It was spend 30 minutes every day or 40 minutes or an hour, depending on the particular assignment, doing this, because that habit of doing it consistently every day for a set time, you just find you'll get better and able to do more over that time. Latin is like you're exercising those mental muscles, and you can't just do it once a week or once every 2 weeks and get the same benefit. And if you do more than an hour of Latin at a time when you're starting and you're still working through, it's hard work. So you burn out. So then you get to be a lot less efficient, and it's discouraging. If you're disciplined and do it every single day for a little bit of time while you're building up your habits, then it won't be discouraging. And you'll actually get more out of it. Doing 2 sentences well in an hour, if that's how long it takes you, is way more effective than cramming 10 and spending 5 hours doing them. It's just, you've lost the benefit at that point. So,
makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's how much you put into it. So much of it, I think sometimes students get caught up in others in the process, but the process should be consistency, and however you're doing it, spending time doing it, not being afraid to make mistakes, realizing where your mistakes are so you can ask questions and kind of have fun with it. I mean, it seems really basic, but no one ever said, I wish I wouldn't have learned Latin. I really regret I learned Latin. So I think
Right.
spend time in that consistent time. It makes a big difference. A big difference. I think that's great to make your assignments in that way. Spend this much time doing Latin rather than supply these 10 sentences. Although that's the way I do some of my classes. But yeah, they'll put it off and then they'll turn it in right before class as fast as they can. And it's not the same thing as even spending 20 minutes a day for several days, even if you get less technically done. It is time, and it takes time to really get it. It takes time. It's the old festina lente with Maximilian Kolbe. Hurry up slowly. So stay at it and stay diligent, and it'll come. If you do it for long enough, you will get it.
Yeah, that parallels so closely my experience of piano practice, right? You tell the difference. A teacher will tell the difference if we have showed up to the next lesson. I just spent 4 hours on these technical exercises today rather than a little bit every day since my last lesson. Well, okay, y'all. Can't do the y'alls. Sorry, can't do it. It's been fabulous starting the week with all y'all. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks for having us.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary our Mother, pray for us. Saint Maximilian Kolbe, pray for us. Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam.